They said she just gave up, the doctor told me, his voice steady and clinical. My mother was gone. 3 weeks in the hospital, and she was simply gone. I was 52 years old, standing in a fluorescent-lit hallway that smelled like bleach and broken promises, listening to a man in a white coat explain away the death of the woman who had raised me alone. He used words like natural decline and end-stage complications. The words meant nothing. They meant everything. I nodded because that's what you do when doctors speak. You accept their authority, you trust their expertise, you sign the forms they slide across the desk without reading every line. I had been so focused on being strong for my younger brother Keviel, on making arrangements, on calling relatives, that I hadn't asked the right questions. Not yet. That was the first mistake. The second mistake was not listening to my gut when something felt wrong the moment I walked into her hospital room on that final morning. The hospital had called at 6:47 a.m. I remember the exact time because I checked my phone, still half asleep, thinking it was too early for good news. It never is. My mother, Evieta, had been admitted with pneumonia complicated by her existing heart condition. She was 78, but she had been living independently, volunteering at the community center 3 days a week, maintaining her own garden. She was not the fragile, fading woman they described to me during those 3 weeks. I drove to Metropolitan Hospital in a state of controlled panic. My hands steady on the wheel, but my mind racing. Evieta had raised me after my father left when I was 4. She worked double shifts as a nurse herself, which now seems like some cruel cosmic joke. She understood hospitals. She understood medicine. She would have known what to ask, what to watch for. But she was the one lying in the bed, and I was the one who had to make decisions I wasn't equipped to make. The moment I entered her room that first morning, I felt it. Not sadness, not yet. Confusion. My mother lay in the hospital bed, propped up with pillows, her breathing labored but steady. An IV ran into her left arm. A monitor beeped rhythmically beside her, but her eyes were sharp, clear. She reached for my hand, and her grip was firm. "Miara, they keep giving me pills I don't recognize," she whispered. I asked what they were for, and the nurse just said it was part of my treatment plan. I should have investigated right then. I should have demanded a full list of medications. I should have asked to speak with her primary physician. Instead, I kissed her forehead, told her to rest, and went to the cafeteria to get coffee. I was tired. I had taken time off work, but the stress of logistics, arranging her care, managing her apartment, dealing with insurance, had consumed my focus. I wasn't thinking like a daughter should think. I was thinking like someone trying to solve a problem, to manage a crisis. I was failing her. Over the next 3 weeks, my mother's condition deteriorated in a way that seemed both gradual and sudden. Some days she was alert and frustrated about being hospitalized. Other days she was drowsy, confused, asking me questions she had asked me the day before. The doctors assured me this was normal. Patients at this age often experience cognitive fluctuations, one physician said. It's part of the process. What process? The process of dying? Or the process of something else? I visited every day. I sat beside her bed, held her hand, and watched the monitors. I noticed things, small things. The way the nurses seemed rushed, spending less time with her than with other patients. The way certain medications appeared on her chart that I hadn't been informed about. The way her breathing seemed to worsen after she received certain injections, then improve slightly, then worsen again. It was like watching someone play with a dimmer switch, turning her down incrementally, so gradually that you almost didn't notice until the light was nearly gone. One afternoon, Keviel came to visit. My brother was younger by 7 years, more trusting by nature, more willing to accept what authority figures told him. He sat across from me in the uncomfortable plastic chair and said, "She looks so tired, Miara. I think she's just ready to let go." I felt something sharp twist in my chest. She wasn't ready. I wasn't ready. But I didn't argue with him. I just nodded and watched my mother sleep. That night, I drove home and sat in my kitchen with my laptop. I pulled up her hospital records online, the patient portal that all hospitals maintained now. I scrolled through the medication list, and I started writing down names I didn't recognize. Propofol, midazolam, lorazepam. Then I started searching. My hands found the keyboard, and my fingers moved with purpose for the first time in weeks. Propofol was a sedative, commonly used in anesthesia. Midazolam was a benzodiazepine used for anxiety and sedation. Lorazepam was another benzodiazepine. But why would my mother, admitted with pneumonia, need powerful sedatives? Why would she need them in increasing doses? I pulled up her vital signs from the portal. Her oxygen levels had been declining. Her blood pressure had been dropping. Her heart rate had become irregular. I sat back in my chair, and the room seemed to tilt slightly. I wasn't a doctor, but I had taken biology in college. I had spent my career in human resources, not medicine. But I knew enough to understand that combining sedatives could suppress respiratory function, especially in an elderly patient with pneumonia, especially if those sedatives were being administered without proper monitoring or informed consent. The next morning, I called the hospital and asked to speak with my mother's physician. I was told he was in rounds and would call me back. He didn't call back until late afternoon. When he did, his voice was warm and patronizing in a way that made my skin crawl. "Mrs. Moreno, your mother is resting comfortably. That's what matters most at this stage. We're focused on keeping her comfortable." "Comfortable?" I repeated. "Doctor, I've been reviewing her medication list. Can you explain why she's on 3 different sedatives?" There was a pause, a long pause. Then he said, "Your mother was experiencing anxiety about her hospitalization. These medications help manage that." "She was managing fine," I said. "She was alert, she was talking. Now she barely opens her eyes." "That's the natural progression of her condition," he said. "These medications are appropriate for end-of-life care." End-of-life care? Those words landed like a punch. "She's not dying," I said. "She came in with pneumonia. Pneumonia is treatable." "In patients her age with comorbidities, complications can arise quickly," he said. His tone suggested this conversation was beneath him, that I was being an unreasonable daughter who didn't understand medicine. "I assure you, we're doing everything we can." But we weren't doing everything. We were doing the opposite. I could feel it now, the certainty settling over me like a cold fog. Something was wrong. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. I drove to the hospital that evening and found my mother's nurse, a woman named Clara, who had been kind to me during my visits. I found her in the hallway outside my mother's room. "Clara, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." She looked at me, and something in her expression shifted. She glanced around, then gently took my elbow and guided me to a small alcove near the supply closet. "What's wrong?" she asked. "My mother's medications," I said. "The sedatives? Why are they being increased if she's not in pain? If she's not anxious?" Trinara's jaw tightened. She looked down the hallway, then back at me. "I shouldn't say anything," she whispered. "But your mother asked me the same thing yesterday. She asked me why she was being given so much medication when she felt fine. She said she wanted to go home." The floor seemed to shift beneath my feet. "She said that?" "Yes. She was lucid. She was frustrated. She said the medication was making her drowsy, that she didn't want it anymore. Trinara paused, her voice dropping even lower. I documented it in her chart. I noted that the patient was refusing medication. But the next shift, the medication was administered anyway. And the dose was higher. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I was standing in a hospital hallway, in the fluorescent-lit, antiseptic-smelling corridor where my mother was lying in a bed, being systematically sedated into oblivion. And no one was stopping it. "Has anyone else mentioned this?" I asked. Trinara shook her head. "I've worked here for 12 years. I've seen this pattern before." It happens with elderly patients, especially those without strong family advocacy. Hospitals are under pressure to manage beds, to move patients through. Comfort care, they call it. But sometimes, she trailed off, not finishing the thought. I didn't need her to finish it. I understood. Sometimes, comfort care was a euphemism for hastening death. Sometimes, it was easier to sedate a patient into the grave than to treat them aggressively. Sometimes, it was about hospital efficiency and insurance coverage, and the simple fact that an elderly woman with limited family oversight could be managed away quietly. I went back to my mother's room. She was asleep, her breathing shallow and slow. I sat beside her and held her hand, and I felt the weight of every decision I had made in the past 3 weeks. Every time I had accepted a doctor's explanation without questioning it. Every time I had been too tired or too overwhelmed to advocate for her. Every time I had let the system do what it wanted because I didn't know how to fight it. I pulled out my phone and called my brother. "Keviel, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Something is wrong with how they're treating Mom. I think they're over-medicating her deliberately." "What are you talking about?" His voice was confused, resistant. "They're giving her sedatives she didn't ask for. She wanted to refuse them, but they gave them anyway. I think they're hastening her death." "Miara, that's insane." "Why would they do that?" "I don't know. Hospital policy? Insurance? Bed management? I don't know. But I know it's happening, and I need you to help me stop it." There was a long silence. Then Keviel said, "I'll come tomorrow morning. We'll talk to the doctors together." But tomorrow morning was too late. I sat in the hospital all night. I pulled a chair close to my mother's bed, and I watched her. I watched the monitors. I watched the nurses come and go. And around 3 a.m., I noticed something. The respiratory rate on the monitor was dropping. 11 breaths per minute. 9. 8. I hit the call button. A nurse came in, not Trinara, and looked at the monitor. "It's fine," she said. "That's normal for patients on these medications." "It's not normal," I said. "She's barely breathing." "She's comfortable," the nurse said, and she left. I stood up and moved to the bed. I took my mother's hand. Her skin was cool. Her pulse was faint. I could feel the life draining out of her like water through a sieve, and I was powerless to stop it. I wanted to rip out the IV. I wanted to shake her awake. I wanted to scream at every person in this hospital that they were murdering my mother in slow motion, and everyone was pretending it was mercy. At 4:15 a.m., her breathing stopped. The monitor alarmed. A code team rushed in, but they didn't try very hard. They went through the motions, but their movements lacked urgency. Within minutes, they stopped. My mother was gone. The doctor who arrived to pronounce her dead was the same one I had spoken to on the phone. He looked at me with something that might have been sympathy, or might have been calculation. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said. "Your mother was a remarkable woman." She simply couldn't fight anymore. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I was standing over my mother's body, and I was thinking about every sedative dose, every medication increase, every moment when she had been too drowsy to advocate for herself. I was thinking about Trinara's words. I was thinking about the pattern she had seen before. The next hours were a blur. Keviel arrived and broke down. The hospital staff was kind and efficient. They handed me paperwork to sign. They explained funeral arrangements. They offered me coffee and condolences. I signed everything they put in front of me because I was numb, because I was grieving, because I didn't yet understand what I needed to do. It wasn't until the funeral was over, until the flowers had wilted and the casseroles had been eaten, until I was sitting alone in my apartment on a Tuesday evening, that I began to really investigate. I requested my mother's complete medical records. The hospital took 2 weeks to provide them, and when they arrived, they came with a letter from their legal department suggesting that any questions about her care should be directed to her primary physician. The records were dense, filled with medical jargon and abbreviations. But I read every page. I made a spreadsheet. I listed every medication, every dose, every time it was administered. I noted the dates and times of vital sign changes. I researched each drug combination, and the pattern became undeniable. My mother had been admitted with community-acquired pneumonia. She had been started on antibiotics. That was appropriate. But within 3 days, sedatives had been added to her chart. Within a week, the doses had been increased. Within 2 weeks, she was receiving medications that were contraindicated for someone with her heart condition and respiratory status. I found a notation in her chart from Trinara. Patient states she does not wish to continue sedative medications. Patient is alert and oriented. Patient requesting discharge, discussed with physician. But the next entry, from a different nurse on a different shift, simply stated, sedative administered as ordered. I printed everything. I organized it chronologically. I made notes in the margins. And then I did something I should have done the moment my mother died. I called a lawyer. The attorney I found specialized in medical malpractice. His name was Nixon Perez, and he listened to my story with the kind of focused attention that made me feel like someone was finally taking this seriously. I brought him the spreadsheet, the medical records, the notes I had made. I told him about Trinara, about the conversation in the hallway, about the way my mother's condition had deteriorated after each medication increase. "This is serious," he said, and his voice held no doubt. "What you're describing is potential negligence at minimum and potentially something more deliberate." "How do I prove it?" I asked. "We'll need an independent medical review," he said. "We'll need to talk to your mother's nurse. We may need to subpoena hospital records and staff testimony. But first, we need to determine if there's a case." The independent medical review took 2 months. A physician who specialized in geriatric medicine reviewed my mother's case. His conclusion was damning. He found that the sedatives had been administered without adequate justification, that the doses had been increased beyond what was appropriate for her condition, and that the combination of medications had likely contributed to respiratory depression and her death. "In my professional opinion," he wrote, "the patient's death was hastened by inappropriate medication management. The patient was not end of life when admitted. She had a treatable condition. With appropriate care and without the excessive sedation, she would likely have survived." I read those words 3 times. Each time, I felt something break inside me. My mother would likely have survived. The hospital had killed her, and they had done it with the appearance of medical care. Nixon filed suit against Metropolitan Hospital and the physician who had ordered the medications. The hospital's legal team responded with denials and counter-arguments. They claimed my mother's condition had deteriorated naturally. They claimed the medications were appropriate comfort care. They claimed they had acted in her best interest. But we had Clara. She was willing to testify. She was willing to go on record about the patient's refusal and the medication administered anyway. She was willing to describe the pattern she had witnessed over her 12 years at the hospital. The hospital's legal team tried to intimidate her. They suggested that her testimony would damage her career. They implied that she was disgruntled, that she had a personal vendetta. But Clara stood firm. She had watched my mother die. She had documented the refusal. She was not going to be silenced. 6 months after filing suit, the hospital offered a settlement. It was substantial. It was also meaningless. No amount of money could bring my mother back. No settlement could undo the fact that she had been sedated to death while I stood by. Too trusting, too overwhelmed, too willing to believe that the system was working in her best interest. I accepted the settlement because Nixon advised it, because fighting further would take years, because I needed to move forward somehow. But I also did something else. I filed a complaint with the state medical board against the physician. I contacted the hospital's administration and demanded a review of their protocols for medication administration in elderly patients. I spoke to local news outlets about what had happened. The story ran on the evening news. Local hospital faces questions about end-of-life care practices. It was a small story, buried after the weather forecast. But it was something. It was a record. It was a warning. The hospital implemented new protocols. They required written consent from patients before administering sedatives. They required family notification before medication changes. They established an ethics committee to review end-of-life cases. Were these changes because of my mother's death? Because of the lawsuit? Because of the news story? I didn't know. But they happened. I never returned to my job in human resources. I couldn't sit in an office and manage employee benefits and retirement plans while knowing what I knew about how systems failed the vulnerable. Instead, I started volunteering as a patient advocate. I worked with elderly patients and their families, helping them navigate hospitals, understand medical recommendations, ask the right questions. Clara left Metropolitan Hospital. She took a position at a smaller facility where she said the culture was different, where patient advocacy was valued over efficiency metrics. We stayed in touch. We had become unlikely friends, bonded by the experience of witnessing something wrong and choosing to act. Keviel struggled for a long time. He carried guilt about not questioning things sooner, about accepting the doctor's explanations without pushing back. We went to therapy together for a while. We talked about how the system was designed to make people like us feel helpless, to make us defer to authority, to make us trust that everything was being done correctly. A year after my mother's death, I was at a patient advocacy conference when I met another woman whose mother had died under similar circumstances at Metropolitan Hospital. Then another. Then another. There was a pattern. There was a system. And the system was designed to move elderly patients through efficiently, regardless of whether they could recover. I started documenting these cases. I worked with Nixon to identify other potential victims. We found 7 families who had lost elderly relatives at Metropolitan Hospital, under circumstances similar to my mother's. 7 families who had trusted the system and been failed by it. The hospital settled with all of us. The amounts were smaller than my settlement, but they were substantial enough to get the family's attention. More importantly, the hospital finally implemented a comprehensive review of their end-of-life care practices. They brought in external oversight. They changed their medication protocols. They created a requirement for family involvement in all care decisions. Did it bring my mother back? No. Would it save every elderly patient who entered that hospital? No. But it was something. It was accountability. It was a system that had been forced to acknowledge that it had failed and to change. 2 years after my mother's death, I was sitting in my apartment, the same apartment where I had made the spreadsheet, where I had realized what had happened, and I thought about how different my life had become. I had left my career. I had dedicated myself to patient advocacy. I had spent countless hours fighting a system that was designed to resist accountability. I thought about my mother, about how she had spent her career as a nurse, caring for patients, trusting the system she worked within, about how that same system had failed her when she needed it most, about how she had tried to refuse medication and no one had listened. I also thought about Clara, about her courage in testifying, about how she had risked her career to tell the truth. I thought about the other families I had met, about the grief they carried, about how they had all been failed in similar ways. And I thought about the work that remained. There were other hospitals, other systems, other elderly patients being sedated into oblivion while families stood by, trusting, not questioning, not knowing what questions to ask. I picked up the phone and called Nixon. "I want to expand this," I said. "I want to look at other hospitals. I want to identify patterns. I want to create resources for families so they know what to watch for, what to ask, how to advocate." "That's a big undertaking," he said. "Yes," I replied, "but it's necessary." Today, 3 years after my mother's death, I run a non-profit organization called the Patient Advocacy Network. We train family members to recognize warning signs in hospital care. We provide resources for questioning medical recommendations. We work with whistleblowers like Clara to expose systemic failures. We have helped dozens of families identify inappropriate care and take action. We have also identified patterns of medication overuse in elderly patients at multiple hospitals. We have worked with state regulators to implement new oversight protocols. We have changed policies and procedures. We have saved lives. My mother's death was not in vain. Her story became a catalyst for change. And while I would trade everything, the settlement, the organization, the recognition, to have her back, I know that this is how I honor her memory, by fighting the system that failed her, by making sure that other families don't stand in hospital hallways, trusting, unquestioning, while their loved ones are systematically sedated to death. If you suspect that a loved one is receiving inappropriate care, ask questions, demand answers, document everything, get a second opinion, hire an advocate. Don't trust the system to protect your family. Be the advocate your loved ones need. If you want more stories like this, stick around.